The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 86.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the EL. Today we have Salim Ismail, author of Exponential Organizations. Why new organizations are 10 times better, faster, and cheaper than yours. Welcome, Salim, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Sure. My name is Salim Ismail. I'm the founding executive director and current global ambassador for Singularity University. We're based at NASA Ames, and we think about how do we create a new generation of leadership that can leverage accelerating technologies to solve major global problems. That's our mission statement, our purpose. I've been doing this for about 6 years. I was the head of innovation at Yahoo before that, ran their incubator called Brickhouse, tech entrepreneurship before that, and I'm Canadian.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. Now let's jump right into your book, Exponential Organizations, which was just made available for purchase on October 14th, 2014. And Salim, we're going to move quickly, but we're really going to cover the top questions that our listener/reader would love to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Exponential Organizations?
Yeah, so, literally as we launched Singularity 5-6 years ago, we noticed that at the same time that a very different model has come about onto how we build organizations. We've learned how to scale technology really well, but scaling the organization and building that is painfully incremental and painfully linear, right? And has always been that way. But literally in the last 5 years or so, we're seeing a new breed of organizational structure that can scale in the same seamless way that we can scale technology. So I noticed that kind of as a weak signal 5 years ago, started tracking it. And then over the last 3-4 years, we found 60 organizations that are scaling at an average 10 times better, faster, cheaper, better compared to their peers. And so we started documenting those 60 organizations and tracking them. And then 3 years ago, we decided to write a book on the model.
Excellent. What would you say makes your book different from others regarding a similar or the same topic?
I think that because we focused on accelerating technologies and we focused on the future, we've identified a kind of an inflection point in how we build businesses that's never been noticed before. And I think that's the key. All of our old org structures are about gathering an asset or a workforce and putting a boundary around it and then selling access to that scarcity, right? Whereas these new businesses are learning how to scale their business functions and their organizational elements outside the core organization. And we've just never seen that before. And so that's kind of fairly new. We think that's unique.
And how would you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this one that they should really start from beginning and read all the way through? Or is this one they can jump in and cherry pick information out as needed?
They can jump in and cherry pick as needed. I would suggest reading the first 2-3 chapters through because it lays the premise and the basis for the book that we're turning the world into information. And as we digitize a domain, it becomes very open to disruption. And that becomes the vector for an entrepreneur to go attack another space. And then the book goes into what are the characteristics of... So what we did was we cataloged the 60 or so organizations scaling this quickly and what were the kind of common characteristics and features that they're using to scale. And we found 10 of them. And so we documented 5 external characteristics and externalities like community and crowd or algorithms or gamification, etc., and then 5 internal mechanisms. So the first half of the book is what are these mechanisms? And the second half of the book is how do you do it? How do you apply it to a startup or a mid-market company or retrofit to an existing organization?
Okay, fantastic. So you just started getting into a little bit. Now we're going to take a deep dive.
Sure.
And so we know the purpose, we know some of the inspiration behind it. And really what I want to do is hand over the mic to you and allow you to really take us, to take the listener/reader and let them know exactly what they can get out of it. Will you do that for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
So Peter Diamandis, who's the founder of Singularity University and the founder of the Express Foundation, he just got named by Fortune and CNN as one of the top 50 leaders globally. He wrote the foreword to the book, and he has been helping me, and a lot of our faculty at Singularity have been helping me with the book. It's a Singularity University publication. We open chapter 1 basically by saying the world is moving exponentially quicker, right? As we digitize things, we hop onto what we call Moore's Law, and the pace of change moves very, very quickly at an accelerating pace. And we're now seeing where we saw computers move at this pace over the last 50, 60 years based on Moore's Law. We're now seeing 6, 7, 8 other technologies all hop onto that same curve. Drones, synthetic biology, 3D printing, sensors, artificial intelligence, robotics, even energy. Aspects of that are now doubling in their price performance about annually. And so the first chapter is really to give a hard reality check that the world is moving more quickly than we've ever seen it before. The metabolism of the environment is accelerating, right? And so we give some specifics on how that works. The second chapter talks about our organizational structures and the fact that how we organize ourselves is very linear and has been for a long time. All our businesses have inherited a local and linear characteristic where if you needed if you had twice as big of a farm, you need twice as many people to farm it. Or if you had land, you had twice as many people to protect it or secure it. And so we had an arithmetic equation. Even if we automated using technology, it was still a linear equation, right? One bullock cart will do the work of 5 men, and that multiplies out that way. But what we're seeing today is that an information-based environment actually accelerates. It doesn't just stay linear. And so we're seeing new organizations that are scaling at an accelerated rate, not just as a multiplier. And so the question is, how does the organization adapt? How can you make your organization map to this new accelerated pace to scream out of the gate? And we're seeing these new organizations, as I mentioned, operate at 10x, 50x, 100x faster than that. Let me give you a couple of examples to plant this home. If you're Procter & Gamble, it takes you about 300 days to go from a new idea to a product on a Walmart shelf, okay, for a good product. Quirky, one of these exponential organizations, or EXOs as we call them, Quirky does that same process, new idea to product on a Walmart shelf, in 29 days. So that's a tenth 10 times quicker than Procter & Gamble. If you're Ford or GM, it costs you about $3 billion to create a new car model from scratch. Local Motors, which is an EXO, creates a new car model for about $3 million. Right? So that's 1,000 times improvement on what we've seen before. And we've just never seen these. So the chapter 2 ends by saying, hey, we've entered this new world where things are screaming out of the gate and it's scaling up like we've never seen before. Chapter 3 then looks at what are the 5 externalities of these organizations. And I open chapter 3 by saying all of these exponential organizations have one single visionary mission statement kind of characteristic. They have what I call an MTP, a massive transformative purpose. So if you think about Google, it's organize the world's information, right? Or TED, it's ideas worth spreading. Quirky is invention made accessible. And so all of these new organizations have this very big aspirational, big, hairy, audacious goal with a purpose that aims to transform the world or transform their industry. And so they start there. And then chapter 3 continues to describe 5 externalities that map onto the acronym SCALE, S-C-A-L-E. So S stands for staff on demand, where Uber doesn't employ its own taxi drivers, but it can leverage and tap into an external community of drivers. Or Local Motors will tap into an external community of mechanics to get work done. The second C stands for community and crowd. Organizations like TED leverage their community to scale their organization. The A stands for algorithms, whereas Uber has very sophisticated algorithms for matching drivers to riders, or Google is the granddaddy of this, where it uses its PageRank algorithm as its main weapon of choice. It costs them almost nothing to run a new instantiation of a search query, but it generates about several pennies of revenue per search query, so they have a very nice equation there. The L stands for leveraged assets. Like Airbnb doesn't own its own hotel rooms, it's tapping into an asset that's around it, right? Or Uber doesn't own its own cars. If you own a car, it sits empty 96% of the time, and can you tap into that 96% of it by leveraging this model? And then the E stands for engagement, which is gamification or incentive prizes or digital feedback loops, where you have a really clear sense of what your community or crowd is doing. And we've typically found that gamification is really great for increasing loyalty amongst your customers, and incentive prizes are really great for turning your crowd into community and finding new people to bring into your inner circle. So there's a concentric circle diagram there. And so that's the 5 externalities. And chapter 3 is really about this big transformative purpose plus these 5 externalities that all of these organizations are leveraging some of to scale outside their core organizational boundaries. And this is a key important point, is that they're scaling outside the core team. So Airbnb has mission-critical functions like the usage of a room and getting the keys, etc., that happen outside its organizational walls. It's happening out in the community, right? And so that's a key part of it. Chapter 4 then delves into 5 internal control mechanisms that these organizations are using to manage and track themselves. And that actually maps onto the word ideas, IDEAS. So the I stands for interface processes. Quirky has very specific processes for managing its million inventors, where people are submitting ideas nonstop. So they have to have new customized, it's almost a new form of intellectual property. How do you rank, filter, match, prioritize all of these flood of ideas coming in? Or Apple authorizing apps on its app store. They have very sophisticated algorithms plus human involvement to decide what apps to approve for the app store. So that's the interface to the external community and those externalities that we talked about earlier. The D stands for dashboards. All of these companies have a real-time metrics and live value metrics that they're tracking so that you know exactly what's happening to the business in real time. Because if you're scaling that quickly, you need kind of this very clear real-time tracking capability. And also for managing employees, all of these EXOs are using what we call objectives and key results, OKRs, that are used by Google, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all use the same technique to manage and track teams. And this is this is kind of the most cutting edge HR mechanism to manage and track performance these days. Long gone are the kind of old quarterly ranking and like, God help you if you're using stack ranking these days. But this OKR methodology seems to be the way that all these organizations are tracking performance and so on. And then the E stands for experimentation. Many of your listeners will be familiar with the lean startup philosophy. This is essentially an extension of that, where if the external world is changing so fast, you need to constantly tweak your processes to adapt and constantly stay in tune with what's happening on the external side. And so everybody is constantly tuning and tweaking their performance and their processes to keep pace and constantly taking risk. The other side of experimentation is you have to constantly be testing and taking risk with the processes, even in areas like HR and legal. Okay, the A stands for autonomy. A really fascinating attribute of these new org structures is they're gone as the old hierarchical, siloed management structure. We're now moving to very decentralized, autonomous structures. A company like Valve Software out of Seattle, for example, has no CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no middle management, no meetings. They operate like a beehive. And Zappos, the e-commerce company, is moving to that. And we're finding quite a few of these exponential organizations that take on these decentralized structures to operate. And then the S stands for social technologies, the use of activity streams, file sharing, Google Docs, using cloud to do everything. So they have one view of the customer. You have instant awareness of what's happening across the organization. So that's chapter 4. What we found is that if you implement 4 out of the 10 attributes that we've described in chapter 3 and 4, you'll get to the 10x level. And some use more, but all of them that to achieve the 10x, you implement 4 or more. Then I do chapter 5 is really summarizes and says, what are the implications of this new model? So one is that we're demonetizing everything. We're dematerializing everything. Everything's turning into an app. Smaller is better than bigger. It used to be a big organization would give you economies of scale and give you low transaction costs, but you lose flexibility. And the higher order bit today is flexibility. And so having a small org structure is much more important. Having diversity in your team is really critical, interdisciplinary thinking. So it goes through a whole set of implications. There's about 9 or 10 kind of headlines about how to think about the future. One of them, for example, is called The Death of the 5-Year Plan. You can't have a 5-year plan today. By the time you start implementing it, it's out of date. And so you have to think very carefully about how you do that. So that's the first half of the book. The 5 chapters describe the 10 or 11 characteristics of these exponential organizations and the implications of it. Right? The second half of the book, chapter 6 to kind of 10, think about how do you apply this. So chapter 6 is about how do you apply this to a startup. And when you're starting a company from scratch, what sequence do you go in? And now we get prescriptive. Because it's one thing to have this intellectual kind of exercise saying, here are these characteristics. But we found it more interesting to say, what should companies do? Right? And unless you can give them a practical to-do list, really, we're not really adding that much value. And so chapter 6 is, what are the specific steps you can take if you want to launch a startup with these principles in mind that can scale at this 10x level? Chapter 7 is about how do you apply this to a mid-market company? There's a lot of mid-market family-style businesses that have kind of grown early on but have now plateaued. How do you take that and blow it open? And central to the chapter 7 is a guy called Robert Goldberg, who was the first business executive at Zynga. And he scaled Zynga from 30 people to 3,000 people in 10 quarters by doing like 40 acquisitions. 95% of them were successful. And nobody's ever seen that before. And Robert has gone on to do something really interesting. He goes into mid-market companies, and he has a fund that he's raised. And he says, let's work with you. And they try and see if they can double the growth rate in a quarter. Can we double your growth rate in 1 quarter? And if they can do that, then it shows the management is lined up and everybody's interested in doing that. They come in with an investment and try and make it 10x bigger. And over the last 2 years, they've done this to 40 companies. So he's systematized it so you can take one of some of the attributes that we talk about, apply those to existing companies and blow open their performance. And so that's really fascinating. And then chapter 8, 9, and 10 are what do you do if you're a big company? Chapter 8 is how do you organize a big company, because you can't take a big organization and turn it into one of these new animals. It's too disruptive of a change. And you don't want to risk the cash cow and throw the baby out with the bathwater. What you do is take a disruptive set of change agents that exist in all organizations anyway. They're the super loyal, super bright people that have great ideas but are really hard to manage. Take them to the edges of the organization and build one of these exponential organizations off the edge of your own, attacking another marketplace. Apple is probably the genius behind this. They have the core design capabilities and supply chain in their organization, and then they take a disruptive team to the edge and say, go disrupt music or mobile phones and now payments or watches or what have you. Right? And they're literally they've created the most valuable company in the world by applying this organizational model in interesting ways. Right? And then chapter 9 is a set of 8 or 9 case studies of what big companies are successfully doing. Amazon, for example, has done something really fascinating. It's really easy in a big company to say no to an idea. It's really easy. So it's hard to say yes because everybody's incented to say no because all our org structures are built to withstand change, withstand risk, right? So Amazon's put in something called the institutional yes. Whereas if you have a great idea inside Amazon and you go to your manager, their default answer has to be yes. If they want to say no to your idea, they have to write a 2-page thesis as to why it's a bad idea and publicly post that 2-page thesis internally. So they've created friction to saying no, making that many more ideas testable and run through the system. And I document kind of 6 or 8 big companies, Coca-Cola, GE, etc., as to what they're doing as large organizations. And then chapter 10, which is the final chapter, is what's the role of the executive in the future? If you're the CEO or the COO or the head of HR or the head of legal, how will your world change, right? 80% of all the org structure changes we've seen over the last, say, 20 years are 90% internet and a bit of mobile. We're just starting with 3D printing, synthetic biology, neuro-based training, DNA-based recruiting, and how will that impact the org structure of the next 5 to 10 years? So we give an individual executive role view of how the world will change for these people. And then there's an epilogue where I kind of sum it all up and talk about what happens to the economy in general as this paradigm rolls out. And also, in the epilogue, I kind of actually documented the top 10 exponential organizations that we found and looked at their market cap from when we started writing the book to when we finished writing the book 2.5 years later. And we found that many of them have increased their market cap by 10x just in 10 quarters. That's just a staggering pace of change. So the paradigm seems to be very real. So that's kind of an overview of the overall book.
That was a great overview of the book. So thank you for taking us through and giving us the deep dive. And now I'm asking you to kind of break it down one step further. And that's if the reader could only take away one action item out of your entire book or one principle, what would you personally want that to be?
So as we finish the book, the core economic basis of these new exponential organizations kind of bubbled up. And it basically goes as follows. When you're building and running a business, you're worried about managing cost of supply and you're worried about cost of demand, right? And we try to optimize around both sides of that equation. And hopefully your cost of supply is less than your cost of demand. What the internet did 10, 15 years ago for the first time, it allowed us to drop our cost of demand exponentially. Like online marketing, referral marketing. If you get a viral loop going, your acquisition costs go completely to zero, which is kind of this magical place to be. And so we were able to drop the cost of generating demand exponentially with the internet. What these new organizations, these exponential organizations have figured out how to do is they figured out how to drop the cost of supply exponentially. Right? So if you're Airbnb, your marginal cost to adding a hotel room is almost zero. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a whole new hotel, right? Or if you're Uber, adding another car to your fleet is almost zero. If you're familiar with Waze, the traffic app that piggybacks on your GPS to give traffic information, Waze, when they get a new user, it could hit supply and demand. It's kind of like this unbelievable place to be if you're building a business. So these new businesses are building, have no cost of supply and no cost of demand. And that's why they're exploding out of the gate. And if you're an existing business or thinking of starting a business, you have to think about how do you juxtapose with this new world where you have no cost of supply.
All right. So one of the things I like to ask an author is, do they have a favorite quote? Hopefully it's a quote of your own or maybe one that's, I know it's only been out for a short period of time, but one that's resonated with your audience so far.
Yeah, actually, David Rose, who's the CEO and founder of Gust, which is an angel investment platform, and you just wrote a book on angel investing, had a fantastic quote where I asked him about this paradigm, and he said, any organization built for success in the 20th century is doomed for failure in the 21st century. And I thought that really resonated.
Yeah, that's huge. Very good. And we'll have that in we have a revamped show notes that we're going to actually have the quotes, the links from everything that you're going to share with us here today and put them in there so that those that are not able to necessarily write that down can go find it later.
Sure.
And so my last question for you today is obviously you've created a book that'll have a paradigm shift for different individuals or it'll have a huge impact on their life. And this next question is really what is a book that you've read that was a life-changing book that had a huge impact on you?
Actually, I'm going to list two, if you don't mind.
No.
One is the Clayton Christensen's classic, The Innovator's Dilemma, basically saying that big established companies can't do disruptive innovation, right? And we've been struggling with that paradigm for about 20 years, and I think I may address that in the book. The second is just came out a few months ago by Jeremy Rifkin, and it's called The Zero Marginal Cost Society. Now, what Jeremy talks about is that as we drop the cost of supply, which is this idea that I just mentioned, capitalism may end up eating itself because we may have dropped the cost of building businesses and doing things to such a small level that we may actually not have any revenue coming through the system in the future. And it's just an incredibly fascinating, disruptive, big idea that we have to consider. So Google, for example, use it for free, right? They make money in a different way. Same with these new freemium services. So there's so many services now that are almost free that it makes it really fascinating to see where does the economy go from here. And so I find that a really fascinating book.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that one. We actually haven't had that the second one referenced yet. So, Salim, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to get more information on you and your book, Exponential Organizations?
Yeah, there's a website, exponentialorgs.com. And on it, there's a kind of a primer and a description of the book, plus a little couple of clips of videos. And there's also a diagnostic survey on the website where you can actually go through and diagnose, take a 20-question survey, it takes about 10, 15 minutes, and say how exponential or scalable is my organization, and gives you a score and gives you some comparators to the top 10 most exponential businesses we found.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like to get your hands on Exponential Organizations or any of the other material, quotes, references that Salim had, Just look at the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.